Life in 1965, when a boy carried your books home, and that meant something. Back in 1965, there was a language that everybody spoke, and nobody had to teach it to you. It wasn't written down anywhere. It wasn't in a textbook. It was in the way a boy crossed the street when he saw a girl walking alone. It was in the way he reached over, quiet, natural, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and took those books right out of her arms, and she let him. And everybody who saw it knew exactly what it meant. That was 1965. The United States of America was a country that was changing fast. Lord, was it changing fast. You had the Civil Rights Movement, you had the Vietnam buildup, you had the Beatles on every radio dial, and teenagers starting to question everything their parents had taught them. But right there, underneath all of it, right there in the small towns and the suburbs and the neighborhoods all across this country, the old ways were still holding on. And one of those ways was this. A boy showed a girl he liked her by carrying her books home from school. Plain and simple. That was how it was done. Let me take you back there. Let me put you right in the middle of it so you can feel it the way people felt it then. It's a Tuesday afternoon in the fall of 1965. The school bell has just rung, and you can hear it echoing out across the parking lot, across the baseball diamond, fading into the elm trees that line the sidewalk. The air has that first cool bite of October in it, not cold enough for a coat yet, but cool enough that you can feel it on your cheeks. The leaves are starting to turn, gold, orange, a little red at the edges. The sky is that deep blue you only get in October, and the light is long and slanted the way it gets in the afternoon when the season is turning. The girls come out first, or maybe it just feels that way because the boys are watching. They pour out of the double doors in groups of 2 and 3, laughing about something, books pressed against their chests, saddle shoes clicking on the concrete steps. Their skirts hit right at the knee, that was the style then, modest but neat, and their hair was done just so. A lot of the girls wore it flipped at the ends. Some of them had little barrettes. You took care of yourself in those days. You took pride in how you presented yourself. That was just how it was. And then you'd see it. A boy, let's say his name was Tommy, because there were a lot of Tommies in 1965. He'd spot her coming through those doors. Maybe it was a girl from his English class. Maybe he'd been working up the nerve for 3 weeks. He'd say something to his friends, nothing important, just an excuse to break away. And then he'd walk over, casual, unhurried, like he hadn't been thinking about this since first period. He'd fall into step beside her. Hey, just hey. She'd say hey back, and then he'd reach over and take those books, maybe 4 or 5 of them, heavy ones, history and math and an English anthology, and he'd tuck them under his arm like it was nothing, like carrying her books was the easiest, most natural thing he'd ever done. Because for him, it was. That's how his daddy had done it. That's how his older brother had done it. That's just what you did. Now, let's talk about what that actually meant, because it meant a whole lot more than just carrying books. In 1965, young people didn't have the language we have today. Nobody was sending texts. Nobody was posting anything. There was no way to quietly signal your feelings to someone without actually doing something, actually being present, actually showing up. So the gestures carried the whole weight of it. Every little action was looted. And carrying a girl's books, that was one of the clearest signals a boy could send. It said, I see you. I want to be near you. I think you're worth the walk. And the girl knew it. Of course she knew it. She'd been raised in the same world. She understood the language just as well as he did. If she let him take those books, she was saying something back. She was saying, all right then, walk with me. Let's see where this goes. It was a conversation without words, and there was something so beautiful about that, something so honest and true that it almost breaks your heart to think about now. Think about that. Two kids, 15 or 16 years old, walking home through fallen leaves in the October light, carrying on an entire relationship with nothing but proximity and a stack of library books. No likes, no follows, no DMs, just the sound of their shoes on the sidewalk and whatever came out of their mouths when the silence got comfortable enough to fill. Can you imagine? Hand to God, there was a whole world in that walk home. They'd talk about school, sure, the math test that had been murder, the teacher who always called on you when you weren't ready, but they'd also talk about real things, about the Ed Sullivan Show, about the song they'd heard on the radio that morning, about what they wanted to do when they grew up. The conversation was slow the way conversations used to be slow. Nobody was in a hurry to get anywhere. The walk home was the point. The walk home was the whole thing. And the neighborhoods they walked through, Lord, those neighborhoods. The sidewalks were swept clean, the yards were kept up, people took pride in what was theirs. You'd pass by somebody's front porch and there'd be a woman out there with a glass of iced tea, and she'd look up and see those two kids walking by, the boy with the books, the girl with her hands free, and she'd smile. She'd know. Everybody knew. It was a neighborhood. People watched. People cared. That was just America in 1965. Now here's something I want you to really sit with, because this is important. In 1965, the concept of romance was still tied up in effort, real, physical, present tense effort. You couldn't swipe right, you couldn't send a heart emoji, you couldn't like someone's photo at midnight from across town and call that courtship. If you liked somebody, you had to show up. You had to put yourself out there in the real world, in front of real people, where everybody could see you and where rejection was actual, physical, happening right in front of you rejection. That took something. That took guts. The boys who carried books were practicing something. They were practicing showing up. They were practicing putting someone else's comfort ahead of their own. They were practicing what it meant to be a young man in the world, and that meant being useful, being present, being the kind of person who noticed when someone had too much to carry and did something about it without being asked. Their fathers had taught them that. Their grandfathers had lived it. And even in 1965, when everything was shifting and the world was cracking open in 100 different ways, that thread was still unbroken. And the girls? Let me tell you about the girls. They were not waiting to be rescued. Don't let anybody tell you that. The girls of 1965 were smart and quick, and they had opinions about everything, from the Vietnam War to what color to paint their bedrooms. But there was still room in that world for a certain kind of tenderness. There was still room for a gesture to mean something. They weren't confused about what it meant when a boy carried their books. They knew exactly, and they were free to say yes, or they were free to say, no thank you, I've got them. Both were acceptable. Both were honest. That was the thing about it. It was clear. Let me tell you about a particular kind of afternoon that happened all over this country in 1965. Maybe it happened in your town. Maybe someone told you about it. Maybe you were there. It's getting toward 4 o'clock. The walk home has been taking longer than it should because neither one of them has been in any kind of hurry. They've been walking slow, the way people walk when they don't want the walk to end. The street is getting quieter. Most of the other kids have peeled off toward their own houses, their own front porches, their own mothers calling them in. Now it's just the two of them, and the books are getting heavy, and they're getting close to her house. There it is, her house. White clapboard or maybe brick with a maple in the front yard and a bicycle leaning against the porch railing. Maybe her mother is behind the curtain in the front window, pretending not to watch. The boy stops at the end of the front walk. He doesn't come up to the porch unless he's been invited. He hands the books back, careful, like there's something worth being careful with. She takes them. They look at each other for a second, and in that second, that 1 second, everything that's going to happen between them is already being decided. Maybe he says he'll see her tomorrow. Maybe she says, yeah, maybe. Maybe there's the beginning of a smile on her face that she's trying very hard to keep small. Maybe he walks away and she goes up the porch steps and through the screen door and puts her books down on the kitchen table, and her mother says, without looking up from whatever she's doing, "Who was that?" And she says, "Nobody." And her mother smiles at the pot she's stirring because she knows exactly who that was. Ah, those days. What a time that was. You have to understand, in 1965, the act of walking someone home was protected time, precious time. There was no way to communicate with someone between the moment you parted and the moment you saw them again. No texts, no calls really, not easily. Most families had one phone on the wall in the kitchen, and your mother was almost certainly standing within earshot. So whatever you said on that walk home, whatever you decided, whatever shy and hopeful thing you admitted to each other, that was yours, just yours. You carried it home with you, private and warm, and you thought about it all evening through dinner and homework and the 7 o'clock news on the living room TV. That was what young love felt like in 1965. It felt like something you had to wait for, something that grew slowly at the pace of walking, not instant, not immediate, not available at the tap of a screen. You had to let it develop the way you let a photograph develop in a darkroom, in the dark, slowly, image emerging out of nothing. You didn't get to check it every 30 seconds. You had to trust the process. You had to be patient. And maybe because of that, maybe because it was slow and patient and built out of small, real gestures instead of fast, easy ones, maybe because of that, it meant more. When a boy finally got up the nerve to ask a girl to the school dance, she knew how long it had been building. She'd watched him carry those books for weeks. She'd seen him show up day after day without being asked. And that meant something. That told her something real about who he was. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking that was a different time. And you're right. It was a different time in ways that go deep. 1965 had its problems, serious ones, painful ones. The country was in the middle of one of the most turbulent chapters in its history. The civil rights movement was forcing America to look at itself hard and honest, and it was a reckoning long overdue. Young men were getting drafted. Families were worried. The world was not a simple place. But here's the thing, and I mean this. People still got up in the morning. They still packed their kids' lunches. They still sent them to school. And on the way home from school, boys still carried girls' books. Life was still happening, tender and ordinary, right alongside the history. Maybe that's what's most remarkable about it. That ordinary life keeps going. That tenderness keeps finding its way through, even when the world is hard, maybe especially then. The parents of those teenagers in 1965 had lived through the Depression. They'd lived through World War II. They'd built their families in the aftermath of things that should have broken them, and they hadn't been broken. So they raised their children with a certain toughness and a certain gentleness at the same time. They taught their sons to work hard and to treat women well. They taught their daughters to have standards and to know their own worth. And then they let them go out into the afternoon, and they watched from the window, and they trusted the world enough to let it happen. Let me tell you something about the books themselves, because there's something almost poetic about it when you think about it. In 1965, your textbooks were everything. You had one set issued to you at the start of the school year, and you carried them everywhere. History, English, math, science, they were heavy, and they were yours for the year, and your name was written inside the front cover in your best handwriting. You were responsible for those books. You took care of them, and you carried them with you every single day, to school in the morning and home in the afternoon, because your homework was in there, and there was no cloud to save it to, no tablet to pull it up on. The book was the record. The book was the thing. So when a boy took those books from you, he was taking on something real. He was carrying your schoolwork, your homework, your little pencil notes in the margins. He was carrying something that was genuinely yours, and he was doing it carefully, the way you'd want someone to carry something that belonged to you. That was part of the message. I will take care of what is yours. I will not be careless with it. That's a thing worth saying. That's a thing worth meaning. And the girl who handed them over, even for just a few blocks, she was saying, "All right, I trust you with this." That trust was the beginning of something, and sometimes that something lasted for years. I know people who started exactly that way. A boy, a stack of books, a walk home, and 55 years later, they're still sitting at the same kitchen table, him reading the paper and her with her coffee. And if you ask them how it started, they'd probably both smile and tell you the same story. And here's what I think gets lost when we look back at 1965. Here's what I think we forget sometimes. People were just as nervous then, just as unsure, just as tangled up in their own feelings. Don't let the clean haircuts and the pressed skirts fool you into thinking it was easy. It wasn't easier, it was just expressed differently. A boy standing at the end of the front walk, handing back a stack of textbooks, his heart going 100 miles an hour. That was the same feeling, the same exact feeling that people have had for 10,000 years, dressed in saddle shoes and a leather jacket. The nervousness was real, the hope was real, the fear of rejection was real. And the moment, that moment when the answer starts to become clear, when you can see in someone's face whether this is going to be something or nothing, that moment was real and sharp, and it stayed with you. You didn't forget it. Even now, all these years later, if you lived this, you can probably remember the afternoon, the light, the leaves, the weight of those books passing from one pair of hands to another. Because that's how memory works with moments that matter. They stay clear. The details stay. The color of the leaves, the slap of the screen door, the particular way somebody looked at you on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in October 1965. Those things don't fade the way other things do. They keep. Now, I want to talk for a minute about the culture that made this possible, because it didn't just happen by accident. In 1965, most kids walked to school. They walked home from school. They existed in a physical world, in a neighborhood, on streets where they were known, where their families were known, where their history was part of the landscape. That kind of rootedness created a kind of natural choreography of community. You knew who lived in every house on the block. You knew the family who'd had the loss last spring and the family who'd had the baby and the old man on the corner who used to play ball for the minor leagues and who'd tell you about it if you had time to listen. In that world, a boy carrying a girl's books was a public act. Everybody on the street saw it. Everybody in the neighborhood understood it. And that public quality wasn't a burden, it was a kind of protection. You behaved well because people were watching, but also because they mattered to you. Their opinion mattered. Your family's reputation in the neighborhood mattered. The accountability was real, and it wasn't oppressive. It was just community. That's what community actually looks like when it's working. The school itself was part of this. In 1965, most kids went to their neighborhood school. They walked there with the same kids they'd grown up with, kids who knew their parents, kids who would be at their graduation and their wedding, and eventually their kids' school plays. The continuity was deep. And because of that continuity, the rituals meant something. The rituals were part of the fabric. Carrying books home was one thread in a very long, very strong weave. Let me paint you one more picture, one more scene from that October afternoon in 1965. There's a girl, let's call her Patty because there were a lot of Patties in 1965, and she's walking home from school by herself. She's carrying her books against her chest the way she always does. She's thinking about the algebra test tomorrow. She's thinking about whether her mother is going to make pot roast tonight because she can smell it from 3 houses away when she gets home. She's not thinking about anything in particular when she hears someone behind her catching up. She knows who it is before she turns around. She knows his footsteps somehow, the way you come to know things you've been paying attention to without letting yourself admit it. She turns around and there he is, a little out of breath from jogging to catch up, hair a little messed up by the wind, looking at her with those eyes that she's been pretending not to notice for 6 weeks. And without a word, without even asking, he reaches out and takes her books, all of them, the whole stack, and he falls into step beside her. And Patty doesn't say a word either. She just lets him. She lets him carry the books and she walks beside him toward the pot roast and the algebra test and the October evening coming in, and somewhere inside her, something that has been a question for 6 weeks, quietly, softly becomes an answer. That is 1965. That is what it felt like. That is what got lost somewhere between then and now, that slow, patient, public, embodied way of saying what you mean by doing something small and true in the real world, in front of real people, on a real street, with real leaves turning in the real October light. We didn't know it then, but we were happy. We were living something that felt ordinary because it was ordinary, and ordinary is another word for blessed if you look at it right. The ordinary Tuesday afternoons, the ordinary walks home, the ordinary moment at the end of the front walk when you hand back the books and your eyes meet for just a second longer than they need to. Kids today will never quite understand this the way those who lived it understood it. The world moves differently now. The language of courtship has changed so completely that sometimes it barely resembles what it was. And that's fine. Every generation finds its own way through. But there is something worth remembering here. There is something worth holding on to. The lesson, if there is one, is this. The gestures matter. The small, real, physical gestures of care. Showing up matters. Being present matters. Taking something heavy from someone who is carrying it, not because you have to, not because anyone is watching, but because you noticed and you wanted to help, that matters. That will always matter. That is not a 1965 thing. That is a human thing. So the next time you pass a school in the afternoon and you see kids coming out in their sneakers and their backpacks and their earbuds in, looking at their phones, don't feel sad for them. Just remember, somewhere under all of it, the feeling is the same. The hope is the same. The nervousness, the noticing, the way someone's face goes a little still when a person they've been watching walks into the room, all of that is exactly the same as it was in October of 1965 on every street in America when a boy crossed the sidewalk and held out his hands and a girl looked at him for just a second before she handed the books over. That happened. It was real. It was America, and it was beautiful. Well, I hope this story found you in a good place tonight. I hope it brought something back, maybe something from your own past, your own October afternoons, your own version of the books and the walk and the front walk at the end. Or maybe it brought back something you heard from your parents or your grandparents, a story told at the kitchen table, a photograph you found in a shoebox, a moment someone described to you with a faraway look in their eyes. These stories are worth keeping. They are worth telling because they remind us not just of what was, but of what matters, what has always mattered and will always matter, no matter what year it is and no matter how much the world changes around us. The small gestures of care, the courage it takes to show up, the patience of letting something grow slowly, the way a single Tuesday afternoon can become a memory you carry for the rest of your life. If this video moved you, if it brought something back, if it made you smile or got you a little misty, which is perfectly all right, go ahead and hit that like button. It means the world. And drop a comment down below. Tell me if you remember this. Tell me if your parents or grandparents told you a story like this. Tell me if you were Patty or if you were the boy with the books. I want to hear it. Every one of those stories deserves to be told. Share this with someone who needs a little warmth today. Share it with a friend, a sibling, a grown child who's been asking what things were like back then. These are the stories that stitch generations together. Don't let them get lost. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We tell these stories every week. Stories from the 1960s, the 70s, the 80s, real American life, real American people, the ordinary days that turn out, looking back, to have been the extraordinary ones. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll see you in the next story.